Have you ever imagined dying surrounded by luxury, but completely alone? Richard Caldwell had it all. A Mercedes in the garage, a mansion with a view of the horizon, bank accounts most people couldn't even dream of. At 58, he had achieved the kind of success that shows up on magazine covers. But that Thursday afternoon, sitting in the front row of an almost empty funeral, Richard discovered a brutal truth. You can have the whole world and still have no one. The Riverside Funeral Home could hold 200 people. All the chairs were there, perfectly lined up, waiting. But there was no one. No co-workers, no distant friends, no last-minute acquaintances. Just a rich man, wearing a suit that cost more than a used car, staring at a coffin that represented everything he had lost while he was busy making money. The clock on the wall marked each second like a silent accusation. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each beat echoing the same painful question. Was it worth it? And then, the door creaked open. A boy walked in, torn sneakers, simple clothes, a beat-up backpack slung over his shoulders. He didn't know the person in the coffin. He didn't know Richard. He had no obligation to be there, but he looked at that empty room, at that lonely man, and did something that would change everything. He chose to stay. What happened over the next few hours didn't involve miracles. There were no impossible twists, just a simple and devastating lesson about the one luxury money can't buy. This is the story of a man who had everything and had nothing, and of a boy who had nothing, but offered everything. Stay with me, because this story will make you rethink what truly matters in life. The parking lot of the Riverside Funeral Home was almost empty that Thursday afternoon. Only 3 cars occupied the spots under the trees. One of them, a spotless black Mercedes, sharply contrasting with the faded paint of the exposed brick building. Inside the main hall, the air conditioning hummed softly, competing with the awkward silence. The burgundy velvet chairs were arranged in perfect rows, as if expecting a crowd, but there was no crowd, not even half a dozen people. There was only one man. Richard Caldwell sat in the front row, alone. Charcoal gray Italian suit, black tie, shoes that probably cost more than the rent on an entire apartment. He was 58 years old, gray hair slicked back, his posture strangely stiff, as if relaxing were a luxury he'd never learned to allow himself. In front of him, the closed coffin rested on a simple pedestal, no elaborate flowers, no wreaths, just a small arrangement of white lilies provided by the funeral home itself, because someone had to fill the emptiness. Richard stared at the coffin, but his eyes weren't really seeing it. They were lost somewhere between regret and disbelief. How was it possible that an entire lifetime could fit there? In that box, in that silence, in that empty room. The clock on the wall read 4:47 p.m. Each tick echoed like an accusation. He took a deep breath, adjusted the tie that was already perfectly straight, and folded his hands in his lap. There were no tears. Not because he felt nothing, but because feeling was dangerous territory, and Richard Caldwell had learned long ago to avoid dangerous places. At 25, he founded his first investment firm. By 30, he was already a millionaire. By 40, his name appeared on lists of influential people. He built an empire based on numbers, strategies, and cold decisions. He never had time for frivolities. Relationships were contracts. Friendships were networking. Love was a distraction. And now, at 58, he was sitting in an empty funeral, realizing that all those choices had brought him exactly there, alone. The funeral home attendant, a middle-aged man with round glasses and a tired expression, passed through the side door carrying a box of tissues. He cast a discreet glance at Richard, as if wanting to ask if everything was okay, but decided it wasn't appropriate. After all, what do you say to a man burying someone with no witnesses? Richard kept staring straight ahead. The empty chairs around him were silent witnesses to a brutal truth. He had always believed he didn't need anyone, that dependence was weakness, that bonds were traps, and now the universe was giving him back exactly what he had cultivated, absolute loneliness. The gray afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Outside, life went on. Cars passed by on the street. People laughed at a nearby cafe. The world kept turning, indifferent to the small, forgotten funeral on Riverside Avenue. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the weight of the empty chairs. But it didn't help. They were still there, screaming in silence. each one representing someone he pushed away, ignored, or simply never bothered to know. He thought of Margaret, his ex-wife who asked for a divorce after 10 years of trying to compete with spreadsheets and meetings. He thought of Thomas, the partner he betrayed for a profitable merger. He thought of Sarah, the daughter who stopped calling after he forgot her birthday for the 5th year in a row. How many empty chairs had he emptied himself? That's when the front door opened. The creak of the old hinges echoed through the hall, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. Richard opened his eyes and turned his head slightly. A boy had walked in. He couldn't have been more than 12. Simple clothes, faded jeans, a white t-shirt with a small stain on the collar, knock-off Nike sneakers that had seen better days. A worn backpack hung from his shoulders. The boy stopped at the entrance, looking around as if he were lost. His eyes scanned the empty chairs, the lonely coffin, and finally landed on Richard. For a brief moment their gazes met, and then, to Richard's complete surprise, the boy started walking toward him. He walked down the center aisle with light, almost silent steps. His worn soles barely made a sound on the wooden floor. Richard watched every movement with a mix of confusion and restrained curiosity. Who was this kid? Why was he there? When he reached the second row of chairs, the boy hesitated. He looked again at the coffin, then at Richard, as if weighing whether it was appropriate to get closer. There was something in his eyes, a seriousness that didn't match his age, as if he'd already seen things children weren't supposed to see. Finally, without asking permission, the boy sat down, not in the back row, keeping a safe distance, not on the other side of the room, but right there, in the front row, leaving just one empty chair between him and Richard. Silence settled over the room again, but now it felt different. It was no longer absolute loneliness. It was a shared silence, almost respectful. Richard didn't know what to do. Should he say something? Ask who he was? Tell him to leave? But the words didn't come. He just sat there, staring ahead, pretending the boy's presence didn't affect him. Minutes dragged on. The boy swung his legs, which didn't reach the floor. The movement was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Richard noticed a small tear on the right side of the boy's sneaker, exposing a gray sock. Not many people showed up, huh? The boy's voice cut through the silence. Richard slowly turned his head. The boy wasn't looking at him, but at the coffin ahead. His expression was neutral, almost casual, like he was commenting on the weather. "No," Richard replied, his voice coming out rougher than he expected. "They didn't." The boy nodded, as if he already knew the answer. "Sometimes it's like that," he went on, still looking forward. "My mom says when nobody shows up, it's not because people are bad. It's because nobody knew how to stay." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Those simple words, spoken by a child, carried a weight that years of expensive therapy had never managed to reach. "Your mom sounds wise," Richard said, almost in a whisper. The boy shrugged. "She works a lot, 2 jobs. Says she has to because we don't have anyone to help us, but she always finds time to stay with me when I need her." Richard swallowed hard. When was the last time he had stayed with someone? When was the last time he chose presence over productivity? "Did you know—" Richard gestured vaguely toward the coffin, unable to finish the sentence. The boy shook his head. "No. I was walking by, saw it was almost empty. Then I thought, I don't know. Nobody should be alone at a time like this, right?" Richard was left speechless. That boy, who clearly didn't have much, who wore torn sneakers and carried a beat-up backpack, had chosen to walk into a complete stranger's funeral just so someone wouldn't be alone. For a moment, Richard wondered if he was hallucinating, if the exhaustion and stress of the past few days had finally cracked something in his sanity. But no, the boy was there, real, swinging his legs and staring up at the ceiling decorated with old moldings. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Daniel," the boy replied. "And yours?" "Richard." "Nice to meet you, Richard," Daniel said with a disarming naturalness. "I'm sorry for your loss." It was a polite phrase, something people say at funerals, but coming from that boy it sounded genuine, sincere, like he truly meant it. Richard nodded, unable to put together a proper response. They stayed there, side by side, in silence again. But this time, Richard noticed something strange. The chair next to him didn't feel so empty anymore. Daniel's presence, as inexplicable as it was, filled something Richard hadn't even known was missing. The clock read 5:15 p.m. The afternoon light was starting to turn yellow, streaming through the windows and painting the room in golden tones. That was when Richard's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. Then it vibrated again and again. With an irritated sigh, Richard pulled it out. 3 messages, all from the office, all urgent, all demanding his immediate attention. By instinct, his fingers were already moving to reply. But then Daniel spoke again. "Are you going to stay?" he asked, looking directly at Richard for the first time. And in those direct brown eyes, Richard saw a much bigger question being asked. Richard looked at the phone in his hands. The screen glowed with urgent notifications, meeting reminders, emails demanding immediate replies. The world outside kept spinning at the pace he himself had imposed on his life. But there, in that forgotten funeral home, time seemed to move differently. He looked at Daniel, who waited for his answer with a patience that didn't match his age. Those brown eyes didn't judge, didn't demand. They simply waited. Richard turned off the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. "I'm staying," he said. A small smile appeared on Daniel's face. It wasn't victory or satisfaction. It was just quiet approval, as if he knew that was the right choice. The next few minutes drifted by in a comfortable silence. Richard realized he didn't feel the need to fill every second with words or productivity. For the first time in years, he simply was present there. Daniel kept swinging his legs, looking around the room with childlike curiosity. His eyes landed on the tall windows, the golden frames, the old chandelier hanging from the ceiling. "This place is nice," he commented. "Kind of sad, but nice." Richard followed the boy's gaze and really looked at the space. How many times had he been in places like this? Always in a rush, always thinking about the next thing, never truly seeing. "Yeah," he agreed. "I never noticed before." Daniel turned to him with genuine curiosity. "Do you go to funerals a lot?" The question was direct, unfiltered. Richard almost smiled at the brutal honesty of childhood. "No," he admitted. "Actually, I avoid them. I used to." "Why?" Richard took a deep breath. "Why, really? Because funerals were uncomfortable? Because they required vulnerability? Because they reminded him that one day he'd be in a coffin too, and maybe no one would come? Because it's hard," he finally said, "seeing people sad, not knowing what to say." Daniel nodded as if he understood perfectly. "My dad died when I was 7, he said with a naturalness that broke Richard's heart. "There were a lot of people at his funeral, but I don't remember most of them. I only remember who stayed, who sat next to me when I cried." Richard felt a knot form in his throat. How could a 12-year-old boy articulate truths he, with all his expensive education and life experience, had never understood? "I'm sorry about your dad," Richard said, and for the first time in a long while, he truly meant it. "Thanks," Daniel replied. "But you know what's funny? I don't remember what people said. I don't remember the advice or the pretty words. I only remember who stayed quiet next to me, who didn't try to fix anything, just stayed." The word echoed in Richard's chest. Stay. Something so simple, so basic, and he had spent his entire life running from it. Always going, always moving, never staying. Silence settled in again, but this time Richard embraced it. It wasn't an uncomfortable emptiness. It was shared space, a mutual presence that required nothing more than existing. Daniel pulled the backpack resting at his feet and unzipped it. From inside, he took out a slightly squished chocolate bar and broke it in half. "Want some?" he offered Richard. It was a small gesture, insignificant to most people. But to Richard, in that moment, it was everything. A boy who clearly didn't have much was sharing the little he had. Richard took the half of the chocolate, feeling a weight far greater than food in his hand. "Thank you," he said, and the word carried far more than gratitude for chocolate. They ate in silence. The chocolate was warm, a little melted at the edges. It probably cost less than $2. But Richard couldn't remember the last time something had meant so much. When they finished, Daniel crumpled the wrapper into a small ball and looked at the coffin again. "Who was the person?" he asked gently. "If you want to tell me, of course." Richard looked at the coffin, the question he had avoided answering, even to himself. "It was," he began, his voice breaking. "It was someone I should have known better." Daniel nodded, not pressing for more details. "Sometimes we only realize those things too late," he said with a wisdom that defied his age. And it was at that moment that the door opened again. A woman hurried in, her hair pulled into a messy bun, still wearing a nurse's uniform. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Daniel. "There you are," she said, relieved and slightly irritated. "Daniel, I told you to wait for me at the library." The boy shrank a little in his chair. Richard looked between mother and son, realizing that this moment was about to end. The woman walked quickly down the aisle, her steps echoing with the urgency of someone who had just come off a long shift. When she got closer, Richard could see her tired features more clearly. Deep dark circles under her eyes, hands rough from work, but kind eyes that softened all the exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, softening her tone. "I just got worried when I couldn't find you." "Sorry, Mom," Daniel replied, genuinely remorseful. "I saw this place and I thought someone needed company." The woman finally noticed Richard. Her eyes widened slightly, as if only now realizing her son had stepped into a stranger's private moment. "Oh my God," she said, bringing a hand to her chest. "Sir, I'm so sorry. He shouldn't have bothered you. Daniel, we're leaving now." "No," Richard said quickly, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. "He didn't bother me. Not at all." The woman hesitated, studying Richard's face as if trying to figure out whether he was just being polite or truly sincere. He really helped," Richard continued, the words coming out more honestly than he had planned. "I was alone here and his voice faltered. He stayed." Something changed in the woman's expression. The exhaustion gave way to deep understanding, as if she knew exactly the weight of those words. "He has that habit," she said softly with quiet pride, "of noticing when someone needs company." Daniel looked at his mother, then at Richard, clearly not wanting to leave yet. "Mom, can we stay just a little longer? Please." The woman glanced at the watch on her wrist, then at Richard, waiting for confirmation that it was okay. "If it's not a bother to you, sir." "Richard," he said, extending his hand. "And it's no bother at all. It would be an honor if you stayed." She shook his hand firmly. "Carol," she said. "Carol Matthews." She sat down next to Daniel, and suddenly that front row, once a desert of loneliness, now held 3 people, 3 strangers brought together by an unlikely moment. Carol adjusted her purse on her lap and looked respectfully at the coffin. "My condolences," she said. "Was it someone close?" Richard stayed quiet for a moment. The question echoed inside him, demanding an answer he wasn't sure how to give. "It was my brother," he finally admitted, the words coming out like a confession. "Half-brother. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. The silence that followed wasn't judgmental. It was understanding. "And you came," Carol said gently. "That says a lot." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I came because I got a call from the hospital. They said he listed me as his emergency contact, even after everything." He shook his head. "I don't even know why." Daniel looked at him with those deep eyes. "Maybe he just wanted you to stay," the boy said simply. The sentence hit Richard like a punch to the gut. How many times had his brother tried to reach out over the years? How many calls ignored? How many invitations declined because Richard was too busy? "I should have answered the calls," Richard said, more to himself than to them. "I should have gone to see him. I should have stayed." Carol gently placed her hand on his arm. "Regret is heavy," she said, "but it doesn't erase the fact that you're here now. That matters too." Richard looked at her, seeing real empathy in those tired eyes. "You lost someone like that too?" he asked. "My husband," Carol replied, squeezing Daniel's hand. "Worked too much trying to give us a better life. One day, his heart just stopped. He was 32. "I'm sorry," Richard said. "Me too," she replied. "But I learned something. The time we don't spend with the people who matter, we never get it back. That's why I work 2 jobs, but I always find time to be with Daniel. Because presence isn't something you can buy. And when we lose someone, that's what hurts the most. Not the fights, not the mistakes, but the time we didn't stay." Carol's words hit Richard deep. He looked at his brother's coffin again, feeling the weight of 15 years of absence. "I built an entire company," he said quietly. "I have more money than I'd even know what to do with, but here I am, with nobody. And my brother," his voice caught, "he died alone in a tiny apartment, and I didn't even know he was sick." Daniel scooted a little closer, closing the space between them. "You're not alone right now," the boy said. And in that moment, for the first time in decades, Richard let a tear roll down his face. Carol offered him a crumpled tissue from her purse. Outside, the sky was starting to darken, and inside the Riverside funeral home, something was changing. The lights flickered briefly, a subtle warning that closing time was coming. The clock on the wall read 6:20 p.m. The man with the round glasses appeared discreetly in the side doorway, clearing his throat softly to get their attention. Richard turned his head and their eyes met. The message was clear. It was time to wrap up. Richard nodded, understanding. After all, funerals had hours. Businesses had protocols. The world worked like that. Everything had its allotted time, its moment to end. He started to stand up, the movement automatic, like someone who'd spent his whole life obeying schedules and closing chapters when it was convenient. Carol also began gathering her things, sliding her purse strap onto her shoulder. "Come on, Daniel," she said gently. "It's late and you still have homework." Daniel looked at Richard, then at the coffin, and finally at his mom. "But shouldn't we stay until the end?" he asked, confused. "Richard's still here." Carol hesitated, clearly torn between being a responsible mom and the compassion she'd shown the whole time. "Honey, we've stayed a long time already. Mr. Richard probably wants to be alone now." But Richard didn't want to be alone. The realization hit him with surprising force. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he didn't want people to leave. He didn't want to return to the solitude he'd built so carefully around himself. He started, but the words got stuck in his throat. The staff member stepped closer, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Caldwell, we're going to need to close in 15 minutes, he said with professional politeness, but firm. "Could you finish up your goodbye? Finish up. Wrap it up. Leave." Richard looked around the room. The chairs still empty. The lonely coffin. His brother's entire life reduced to that forgotten moment on some random Thursday. And then he looked at Daniel and Carol, two strangers who owed him nothing, but who chose to stay when no one else was there. Something inside him cracked, not in the painful way, but in the necessary way, like when a hard shell finally gives so something new can grow. "Can we stay a little longer?" Richard asked, his voice steadier than he expected. The man blinked, surprised. "Sir? Please," Richard insisted. "Just a little longer. I don't want it to be over yet. Not like this." It was the first time in years Richard Caldwell asked for something he couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate, something that depended purely on the kindness of another human being. The man sighed, glancing at the clipboard, then at Richard, then at the lonely coffin. "All right," he said, his tone softening. 30 more minutes, but after that we really do have to close." "Thank you," Richard said, and there was so much gratitude in that word. The man only nodded and stepped away discreetly. Carol looked at Richard with surprise and understanding. She understood what it meant, the courage it took to ask not to be alone. "That's fine," she said, sitting back down. "We'll stay." Daniel smiled and settled into his chair again, like he'd never planned on leaving in the first place. Richard sat down too, but this time his posture was different, less stiff, less defensive, like something inside him had finally given him permission to loosen up. "Thank you," he said to Carol and Daniel, "for staying. I know you don't know me, and you have your own lives. And, hey," Carol cut in gently, "we chose to stay. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to." Daniel nodded. "And besides," the boy added with a small grin, "you shared chocolate with me. That kind of makes us friends now." Richard let out something between a laugh and a sob. When was the last time he'd laughed at a funeral? When was the last time he'd truly connected with someone without ulterior motives or hidden agendas? "Friends," he repeated, trying the word on his tongue like it was a foreign language. "It's been a long time since I had a real friend." "Well," Carol said with a tired but genuine smile, "now you've got two." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't empty. It wasn't heavy. It was filled with a strange, comforting peace. Richard looked at his brother's coffin and, for the first time, let himself feel the pain of loss, the weight of regret. But for the first time, he wasn't carrying it alone. Outside, night had fully fallen. Inside the Riverside funeral home, 3 people sat side by side sharing something priceless, real presence. And then Daniel asked something that changed everything. "Richard, can you tell me about your brother? What was he like?" Daniel's question hung in the air like a gentle invitation. Richard looked at the coffin, then at the boy, and realized no one had asked that. No one had asked who his brother was, only about logistics, paperwork, practical details. but not about the person. Richard took a deep breath, and for the first time in 15 years, he let the memories come back. His name was Michael, he began, voice thick. He was 4 years younger than me. When we were kids, he followed me everywhere. I thought it was annoying back then. A sad smile appeared. But now? Now I'd give anything to have paid more attention to him. Carol listened in respectful silence. Daniel's eyes were locked on Richard, taking in every word. Michael was an artist, Richard continued. He painted, made these huge canvases full of colors I never understood. I used to tell him he needed to do something real with his life, get a serious job. He shook his head. Now I realize I was just jealous. Jealous because he was free in a way I never was. What happened between you two? Daniel asked gently. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. He asked to borrow money to open a studio. It wasn't much. $5,000. I'd just closed a $3 million deal. His voice trembled. And I said no. I told him he needed to learn how to support himself. That art didn't pay the bills. The silence that followed was heavy, but not judgmental. He was hurt, Richard went on. He called me a few times after that, tried to get close again, but I was busy building my empire, too busy to realize I was losing my brother. Carol placed a hand on his shoulder. And now you're here, she said softly, doing what you couldn't do back then, staying. Her words hit something deep. Richard looked at the coffin again, and this time he didn't see only an ending. He saw a second chance, not to fix the past, that was impossible, but to change the future. You know what hurts the most? Richard said, tears running freely now. At the hospital before he died, he asked for me. The nurse told me, he said my name, and I didn't even know he was admitted. Daniel stood up and, without asking permission, hugged Richard. A simple, pure hug, with no strings attached. The kind of hug Richard hadn't received in years. And Richard hugged him back. He held that boy he barely knew like he was holding every lost opportunity, every wasted moment, every connection he'd let slip away. When they pulled apart, Carol's eyes were glassy too. My husband asked for me at the end too, she shared. I was working. I didn't make it in time. She wiped her tears. That's why I learned. I learned that nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important than being present for the people we love. Richard nodded, absorbing the lesson that had cost so much to learn. The staff member appeared again, discreet. Mr. Caldwell, it's time. Richard stood up slowly, but this time he wasn't alone. Carol and Daniel stood with him. Together, the three of them walked up to the coffin. Richard placed his hand on the polished wood and closed his eyes. I'm sorry, Michael, he whispered. I'm sorry I didn't stay, but I promise I'm going to learn. I'm going to do it differently from now on. Daniel took Richard's hand. Carol took the other. And there, in a funeral that had started out empty, 3 people said goodbye to someone only one of them had known, but who, somehow, had connected them all. When they stepped out into the cold night, the parking lot was lit by yellowish streetlights. Richard's black Mercedes looked strangely out of place next to the bus Carol and Daniel were waiting for on the corner. Let me give you a ride, Richard offered. Carol hesitated, but Daniel was already nodding his head. On the way, they talked. About simple things. About Daniel's school. About Carol's 2 jobs. About nothing and everything at the same time. When they stopped in front of their modest apartment, Richard turned off the car but didn't make any move to leave right away. You guys, he began, choosing his words carefully. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow? I know a place. Nothing fancy. Just good food and even better company. Carol smiled. We'd love that. Daniel opened the door but turned back before getting out. Richard, you're not alone, he said, echoing the words he'd spoken hours earlier. And this time, Richard believed it. As he drove back to his huge, empty house, Richard realized something. The chair beside him at the funeral had started out empty, but it didn't end that way. It had filled with meaning, with connection, with humanity. And for the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell understood the simplest and deepest truth of all. Companionship isn't something you buy. It's something you accept, something you nurture, something you choose. Days later, he would donate part of his fortune to an arts program for young people in Michael's memory. But more importantly, he learned how to stay.